How is everybody today? All right. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to a very special event for the College of Architecture and Planning. My name's Keith Diaz-Moore, and I'm Dean of the college. And I wanted to start by thanking AIA Utah for being a partner in this event. There are continuing education credits available, and afterwards, if you can come up front, Angie's got a sign-up sheet that'll be up here for those continuing education credits. In the spirit of bookkeeping, let me also ask you to turn your phone ringers off, if you can, so we're not interrupted. And then finally, as part of our agreement with the Massive Change Network, please no flash photography or recording of any kind at this special event. When we get to the question and answer period, we're not going to have a roaming mic, so if you can project your questions, and Bruce, maybe I can ask you to repeat that question so we have it for the video. As I said, today is a very special day, and we're pleased to host our third Dean's Distinguished Lecturer, Bruce Mau. Bruce Mau serves as Chief Design Officer of Freeman and is the co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Massive Change Network, a global design consultancy based in Chicago. While initially a graphic designer, I think you'll see that he has exploded those boundaries and leverages his design acumen in a range of ways and a range of scales, reflecting the very nature of our own multidisciplinary design program and our college. I am particularly struck by several themes in Bruce's work that align with our college vision. First is the power of story. His work and that of the Massive Change Network reflect an understanding that to effect change, a powerful story to compel action is of necessity. Second is the focus on process. I became most familiar with this in his work, The Incomplete Manifesto for Growth, and his work shows not only a skillfulness of craft, but also a degree of play and fun that's necessary for true innovation. Lastly, I'm taken by his dedication to effect change through design. Exemplified in his quote, "We define design as the ability to envision a better future and systematically work to realize that vision." In other words, design is a method of leadership. As you'll see, the work of this Canadian-born designer and visionary has been dedicated to applying the power of design to transforming the world. Informed by 3 decades of design studio experience and collaborations with many of the world's leading artists and architects, cultural institutions, and global companies, Bruce has evolved his own design thinking methodology to inspire innovative solutions to challenges in any field or environment at any scale. He provides the North Star for why we have made the leap to provide a shared design foundation for all of our students, regardless of major they might eventually select. As Bruce has written, quote, "It's not about the world of design, but the design of the world." Bruce has written and designed more than 200 books, including the landmark architecture title SML-XL, in collaboration with Rem Koolhaas, and the inspiring Massive Change, published by Faden. He's received the Cooper Hewitt Design Mind National Design Award, the Philadelphia Museum of Art Collab Award, the Global Creative Leadership Award from the Louis Blouin Foundation, and the AIGA Gold Medal for Communication and Design. Mau was named the Bill and Stephanie Sick Distinguished Professor at the School of the Art Institute at Chicago and Distinguished Fellow of the Siegel Design Institute at Northwestern University. And now he is a Dean's Distinguished Lecturer at the University of Utah. Would you all please help me in giving a rousing Salt Lake welcome to the one and only Bruce Mau.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Keith. It's really exciting to be here. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. So I want to talk a little bit about my life in architecture and design. It has been an absolutely extraordinary journey so far. I can't imagine a more exciting life. It's just an adventure every day that has taken me to places that I couldn't imagine even existed. Challenges I knew nothing about. And what I want to talk about is really a methodology that we've created called enterprise design. And it's really a method that liberates design from its output. In other words, it's a product agnostic way of thinking. So we don't start with a product that we know we're going to do. We start with a challenge, a question, a situation, a problem, and we are absolutely open to what needs to happen. We don't go in knowing that we're going to do a building or that we're going to do a product. We really look at the challenge at hand and take it from there. So I want to talk to you about kind of how that methodology evolved. As was mentioned, I started as a graphic designer, a communication designer, and I started in the era of in the Gutenberg era. I started when people were still using hot metal type to do graphic design. It was before the introduction of the computer to the workplace. So it really was in the previous era. And I saw the computer happening because typography was one of the first places that we really applied computing as an industry. And I saw it happening and I realized, wow, this is really going to change everything. And it changed my life and it kind of woke me up to a different way of thinking and working. So that's really what I want to talk about. And I'm hoping that we have a good Q&A, but I'll try to tell the story as we go. So I want to start with this kind of context. This is the reality of our world. The idea that we are kind of that the world's going to be the same tomorrow as it was yesterday is really implausible. This is actually what's happening. This is the most important fact of the 20th century. And the fact that set up the 21st century to be the century of change. And you can see that the red line is the developed world, the blue line is the developing world, and you can see where all the growth is happening. But what's so exciting for me is that by around 2050, we'll be somewhere around over 9 billion. And what that, at first you think, well, we're going to add a couple billion. But actually, at the same time, a couple billion are going to fall away. They're going to die during that time. So what you have is really, almost 5 billion new people by mid-century. And that is an opportunity to really reconceive how we live. Because those people will not come into the world knowing what to do. They will be open to new possibilities. And it really is, I think, the most exciting time in human history to be alive and working. Those people are not going to be the same as we were in the past. And their opportunities and, most importantly, their expectations will be entirely different. This is the work of Ray Kurzweil. He shows that by somewhere around 2030, we're going to put, or 2025, we'll be able to put a human brain in your pocket for $1,000. So for the cost of an iPhone, you will have the processing capacity of a human brain. And by around 2050, you'll have the capacity of all the brains in the world in your pocket for $1,000. And what that means is that we will change the way that we change things. We'll change the way that we solve problems and confront the challenges that we have. We're not going to be confronting them with the tools that we had in the last century. It will be an entirely different set of problems. What we see is that the great problems that we have are not failure problems. They're success problems. We have problems because we solved so much. We won so much. We solved challenges that in some cases had vexed us since the beginning of time. And by solving those problems, we created 7.6 billion people. If we had failed more, we would have fewer problems. We'd be 1 billion people, and we could behave however we liked, and it would have no consequence whatsoever. But at 7 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion, everything that we do matters. It affects all these other things. So this is a chart that shows population in a red line, right, from 1750 to today. And all the other lines are the environmental impact that produces. And you can see how they track perfectly with the population. So if we were down here, again, of little consequence. So that's the context in which we're designing. You're working in this world, whether you're aware of it or not. That's really what's going on. And so these problems, these challenges, are an entirely new class of problems. They're not the problems that we faced in the 20th century, and we will not solve them with 20th century tools. We're going to bring a whole new set of tools to them. What we discovered in our work is that design is a leadership method. It's really a way of thinking about leadership. And we have a lot of anecdotal discussion of leadership. If you look at the leadership book industry, there's lots of talks about, thinking about leadership, but there's not a lot of method. In our case, we have a method. Design is a method. Architecture is a method. It's a method for leadership. It's a method that allows us to envision a future, to create a vision, a visual thing. You have the capacity as designers and architects to produce a vision of the future and then to systematically, step by step, execute that vision. That's the best articulation of leadership I could find. That ability to create a visual future and inspire people to go there. And inspire people to move what they do to a new way of living. And for me, that's the methodology that we're building. We need to get better at it. We need to make it as practical and accessible and open as possible for more and more people outside of the design realm to be able to access this methodology. And that's really what we're working on. So we ask ourselves, in our case, we had, as was mentioned, we have 30 years of studio practice. Are there principles from that method, from that practice that we could actually extract and say, here's a principle, here's a way of thinking, anyone can do this. So let's pull it out, develop a kind of method around that principle that we can teach to anybody, and that's really what we've been focused on over the last couple of years. What we discovered is that there are 24 of them. When I look back at all of our work, we realize, there's actually not an infinite number of principles, there are 24. And there might be some subsets, but in fact you can kind of more or less fit them all into these 24. And that means that we can actually create that toolbox, help people get their hands on it, and train them so that they can go out in the world and apply it. And you have to realize that some of these are really profound disorientation to the status quo. So if you look at, we're not separate from or above nature, right? That idea is a totally new idea compared to our history of understanding nature. For most of history, we thought it was given to us, and it was unlimited, and we owned it, and we dominated it, and it was ours to use up as we saw fit. And what we realize now is that, in fact, we are nature. We're not a different, we're not a special case. We are nature just like the rest of nature. In fact, we are less than 1% different than a bonobo, almost identical in our DNA to rats and mice. We're more nature than we care to realize. And in fact, if we don't understand this, we don't understand our place in the universe of nature, we can do really serious damage to the nature and the ecologies that we need to sustain us. Once you start to think this way, you have to think differently about your business. You can't do your business in the old way. You have to think, okay, how does my business fit into an ecology? What is my business as an ecology, as a natural thing? Because if we are nature, our behavior is there for nature, our business is nature. So that's really what we're working on. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And part of the reason I'm thrilled to be here is how long the journey has been from where I began. I was born in northern Canada, about 6 hours north of Toronto, on a farm outside of a mining town in this kind of region of the world where during the winter months it's minus 40 for weeks on end. What that meant in our case was that because our house was built on a kind of rocky hill, we couldn't get running water into the house. So my job as a young man was to go to the well every day in the valley on our farm and get the water and bring it up to the house with, I had a sled with two 45-gallon drums, and I would provide water for a family of 7 every day before I went off to school. And for the longest time, I didn't think that that experience was in any way relevant to what I do as a designer. I kind of made a huge effort to kind of escape that place and become, and go to the city, become a designer, and live a new life. But I realized over time that, in fact, that experience is really central to who I am and what I do. Because I share that experience with about 1 billion people today. About 1 billion of the 7.6 still don't have access to running water. I know what that means. I know how heavy water is for a family of 7. I know the work that it takes to do that. I have that experience, and I have a kind of empathy that goes with it as a result. And at the core, a design practice is a practice of empathy. It's a practice of caring. We define ourselves by how much more than other people we can care. How can we care about our citizens? How can we care about their learning? How can we care about their well-being, their environment, their context? We can't imagine a healthy citizen in a context that is toxic, so we care about the environment. And I realize that across all the design disciplines, that's the common denominator. It's a common denominator of caring. We're obsessed with that individual user experience and how we can improve that. And that's really at the core of being a designer. I became a designer quite by accident. I love images and words and putting them together. And that turned out to be graphic design at the time. And so I really kind of explored that world. I went to college for a short time. I was not successful. I did not graduate. Had a pretty rough time because I thought I was in an art school. And in fact, I was in a school. And the school didn't know it was an art school, apparently. And the more that I explored my own thing, the more trouble I got. But I was very fortunate. I got a job as a designer when I was about halfway through. And I ended up at Pentagram in London. And I had a kind of amazing experience. Spent 2 years there. Pentagram is one of the leading corporate design consultancies in the world. I was there for a couple of years, and it really opened my eyes to what I did not want to do. I did not want to do corporate design for businesses that I did not agree with, that were kind of, in my mind, against me in one way or another, and were trying in some ways to kind of entrap me or limit me in one way or another. And so I went back to Canada and I started a company called Public Good. And at the time, this was over 30 years ago, so the NGO revolution, had not happened. You could count the NGOs on one hand. And we said, look, we just want to use our work, our energy, on things that we believe will improve the world. And it wasn't more sophisticated than that. We didn't have a kind of heavy political agenda. We just said, you know what, we work really hard. I love working. I want to make sure that what I love working on is actually making the world a better place. At the time, a lot of people, it was very controversial, surprisingly. I thought, how controversial can public good be? It turns out that designers were upset with me. They told me to my face that they thought I was crazy. They said, who do you think you are that you can only work on things that are good? I was like, what? They took it as an indictment of them. I said, look, I don't care about you, actually. I just care about me. I just want to work on things that I love. And if I can't, well, I'll discover that. But I think that I can. And it turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life. It's still the core principle that I work with. I start from, we're going to make the world a better place. And we have the capacity to do it. We can do it. And it's turned out to be exactly the case. So I had a little company called Public Good with 2 partners. I met a man named Sanford Quinter, and he asked me to work with him. My partners didn't want to do it, so I said, look, I'm going to do it. I really love this idea. So we went off and we started, I started work with a group called Zone Books. And the first project we did was on the contemporary city, and it introduced a whole new language. And at the time, I was studying urbanism. I was researching cities and urbanism on my own because I just got totally obsessed with it. And so when I met Sanford, we had a conversation immediately that was about this new way of thinking. And he introduced the idea of pantheism, the idea that everything is alive, that everything has the spirit of possibility inside of it, that at any moment, anywhere, a thing could come to life. And that became a kind of way of thinking about design that still is what I do. It's that idea that there is potential everywhere. There is possibility everywhere. Things that seem inert are in fact alive. And there's a life in the world that we have the kind of privilege to explore and understand and engage with and create. And that really started my kind of engagement with architecture, urbanism, and the kind of culture that it assumes. And that concept of everything being alive is really still the way that I work. And the quotation from Sanford, a city book must be legible at every angle and through every surface. The idea that, in fact, we're not trying to illustrate the idea, we're trying to perform it. It's about creating a thing that behaves as the subject. Not that illustrates it, but that actually is a model. We really introduce the concept of design modeling as a communication experience. So when you experience the book, you somehow experience the city. Can we do that? What does that mean? How do we integrate the kind of friction, jump cuts, all the challenges, the kind of experience of the city? How do we make that in the experience of a book? It was a very exciting time. We went on to do Zone 6 together and introduced the notion of incorporations. This is another idea that really has informed everything that I do. The idea of incorporations is that the discrete object is no longer possible. The idea that you can make a thing, a building, a book, that is separate from the ecology that sustains it and the ecologies that it incorporates is not plausible. In fact, we have to think of things as incorporating flows and objects beneath them and being part of larger flows and ecologies above them. And so that, once we start to think that way, the design problem is a totally different problem. It's a problem of ecologies, not of objects. It's not a discrete entity that we cut off from the rest of the world where we throw away any problem we can't solve. So we just decide, you know what, I can't make it sustainable, so I'm not going to bother with that. I'll just cut those things off, and then I don't have to solve that. I'm not going to make it something that grows and evolves, so I cut those problems off, and I end up with something that I can do, that I can sell, and that I can experience as a discrete thing. But that's a false reality. It's really not the way things work and live, and therefore we're really pushing design practice to be true to the world and the way that we live and work. Does that make sense? I'm still trying. It's a very difficult challenge. Now, I totally fell in love with books. Zone 1-2 was the first one I did. I went on to design over 260 books. It's become really a central part of the way that I work and think. Now, almost every project we do, there is a book involved. And the reason is that the book is such a powerful narrative strategy. It's such a powerful narrative technology. It sequences information in time. So we can sequence a story. We can tell a story in a cadence that is designed in the book, and we can access it rapidly. I heard this great presentation where someone said, if we had already had the computer and you designed a book, people would be like, oh my God, that's an incredible technology. That you can just scan it, nothing can beat it, it never crashes. I mean, it's a pretty amazing technology. And it's been a central part of my practice. Around that time, I became deeply obsessed, and remain so, with really understanding kind of a new way of thinking about design. that had happened in the 20th century. And these are all people that really, for me, were kind of central in kind of helping me build a practice. Because, remember, I didn't have an education, so I had to educate myself. So my education is really kind of clumsy and broken and filled with holes, but it's very deep and loving. So you lose the kind of coherence, but you gain in commitment. And so these are all people that, for me, really kind of changed my world. And you look at someone like Georgi Kepes. He ran a program at MIT. He created the Vision and Values series that I recommend everyone in design read because he really set the agenda. He gathered the best minds of the modern world at that time and made this incredible series of books on the power of design and the kind of all the different kind of impacts it would eventually have. So that became a kind of really important part of my work and life. I saw, as I mentioned, I saw the computer coming, so I had to figure out what that was going to mean for my work. I wanted to know, wow, if the computer happens, what does that mean for my design work? What could become possible? I became very interested in that, and to do that research, I had to write things. I never imagined myself an author. I just started writing things down because I needed to do the research, and in the process, I became an author. So I've authored about a dozen books or so, or co-authored, on the changing context of design and what we're doing in the world, what is possible, what becomes possible when our capacity expands and expands. One of the books that I did and one of the people I met was Rem Koolhaas, and we did a project called SML-XL. It was an incredible adventure over 5 years. We both nearly went bankrupt doing it. It was really challenging. And it really was trying to get at a kind of documentary on the reality of architectural practice. Not the pristine, sanitized version that you see in architecture books. And if you look at architecture books, you'd swear that no one ever dies, no one ever has sex, nothing of consequence ever happens in a building. In fact, there are no people in buildings, so why would there be things happening? And so that's actually the kind of image of architecture, and we realized, it's just so off base, it's so out of touch with the reality of digging a hole and changing the world. And that's really what we tried to understand and really convey that crazy reality and what it takes to do that. And we organized it around scale and introduced a kind of new language of bigness. One of the things that was for me very interesting was, we wanted to say, look, an architect is not somehow kind of cut off from the planet. We're working on we're working in the world the same as everyone else, where stuff is happening. So while we were doing the book, the first elections took place in South Africa, and we introduced what we called world images, which is just a whole other vector that kind of intersects and plows into your life and work and reorients the reality of our practice. That collaboration and that kind of work led to very deep collaborations with architects, including Rem. We worked to reimagine the future of the library in the home of Microsoft and reconceive what the social role of the library is and what the possibility is for the library. We eventually collaborated on a new park in Toronto called Tree City, which was kind of super controversial and somewhat of a nightmare to do. But it is eventually, as a park will, it takes a very, very long time to actually become a park, and it's finally happening. Every time I fly into Toronto, I fly over the park, and every time it looks a little bit more like what we imagined. And I'm hoping that one day it will be that. One of the people that I worked with that was really a mentor for me was Frank Gehry. This is the first project I did with him on his Bentwood furniture. And that started a relationship that lasted for, I think, almost 20 years. We did books together. He asked me to help him to communicate the kind of truth in his work. And that led to collaborations on projects like the Concert Hall and the Status Center at MIT, where we were really working on the project itself, not on the publishing, really collaborating on the project. And this is a project we did together for Barry Diller at IAC in New York. And this collaboration was, for me, one of my, I think, favorite things I've ever done. It's a Museum of Biodiversity in Panama City. And in this case, we worked from the inside out, so we really worked on the mandate. What's the mandate of a new institution of biodiversity? It had never been done. No one had ever created a Museum of Biodiversity. So we had to actually think about, what is it? What's our mandate? What are we supposed to be doing in the world? How does that then turn into a narrative, into a story? How does that turn into an experience? And how does that then inform the building? So we were kind of working from the inside out, while Frank and his team were pushing from the outside in. And we really created one team, one studio, in two places where we worked together every day for almost 13 years to create this project. So it starts when you walk into the building, you end up in this thing called the Panorama. And it's like a glass cube, as if you could walk into a cube of cinema. And we can take that cube, and kind of fly it up through the forest, up into the canopy. You can fly across Panama and see the extraordinary diversity of the richness of life. And we can move it, down into the mangroves and into the ocean. And you can see what happened when Panama formed, where you took one ocean ecology and two island ecologies, North and South America, and you connected them into one island ecology and two ocean ecologies. And you can see a kind of fossilized proof of the evolutionary idea of Darwin. This is an exhibit on the Great Biotic Interchange, which is what happens when those two islands form together. That all of a sudden, all the life from both north and south can travel north and south, and you have this incredible killing spree that happens about 6 million years ago, where new predators are introduced on both sides, and whole kind of regions of species are wiped out. And it's an event that's still happening. Not too long ago, Africanized bees were introduced in South America, and they're now in Texas. And they cross through Panama, and they're going north, and that is the Great Biotic Interchange still happening. And you can see where the building is on the kind of entrance to the Panama Canal. It was really quite an extraordinary story. What we saw in that work, as we did all that work, and again, it happened really organically, we just evolved. What we saw, that design was changing from form to content. That, we used to think of design really as, you had the content, now what's the form? And in fact, we were introducing a whole new way of designing that was really about designing the content, and then designing the form. That we saw the world changing from opaque to transparent. When we introduce billions of phones and computers, and we connect them together, we create a transparency that has never happened in the world. So when I started work, if you put up an image, that's what you saw. So if a business or a brand or an institution or a government had an image, and you put that image out, the citizens saw the image, that was it. You couldn't get behind the image to see whether or not it was true. You could not interrogate the image. You would have to be the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal to really question whether that image was true. You needed that kind of resource. Today, we can all look through things, find out what's really going on, and see into the world in a way that is a kind of transparent world. And we can see every day our political class has not got the memo. They continue to operate as if the world is opaque, as if they could hide things. And that era is over. The era of the photo op is over. We live in a new transparent world, and what that means for designers is that when an organization or a business is doing things that are contrary to their mission, they need to be redesigned. So the way that we approach it with our clients is to say, let's just turn off the sound. Forget about what you say. Let's just look at what you do. And if what you're doing isn't the story you want to tell, it needs to be redesigned. So if you pride yourself on being a good citizen business, well, a good citizen business wouldn't destroy the environment that you live in. But here you are doing that, not because you intend to, but because it's a residue of the old way of thinking of discrete entities and not having to deal with the implications of that. And now we can see it all. It's all visible. So that's what happened in our work, that more and more of our clients came to us not for what they looked like, but really for help in designing what they do. What do we do to tell the story we want to tell? And that meant a transition from visual style to what we call enterprise design. And that is really looking at the whole business as a design problem. To say everything that we do, we've designed it. Now, we may have designed it by accident, but we designed it. It is the way it is because we've chosen it to be that way. And therefore, we can make it differently. So if we do things that are bad for the environment, we can change it and design it so that it's good for the environment. There's nothing holding us back from doing that anymore. And if we don't, we will be punished. And the best example that we use is Nike. Nike had the best branding in the world. I mean, nobody came even close. But back of house, they were using child labor. They didn't see that as part of their business. They said, you know what, we're a design business, not a manufacturing business. We're a design business, and we design our products, we design the marketing, we design the experience. We're all about that front end. And what happens back of house is not our concern. But kids saw it differently. They said, you know what, you talk about all these values, and kind of improving life, but back of house you're using child labor to make your product. That's a contradiction. And they stripped billions of dollars out of Nike's brand in the space of a few weeks. And today, if you Google child labor, Nike will still come up on that first page. Now, they come up because now they are a leader in controlling that and designing the supply chain so that doesn't happen. But for the longest time, they came up, and they still come up, as an example of how bad it can be. And that's the new world. That is the new transparent world, and that is why everything is going to be redesigned. Everything we do, everything, will be done differently in the future. Because we cannot do it the way we're doing it now and have a future. E.O. Wilson says it will take 4 planet Earths. Just the physical material to do what we're doing now and meet the needs of 7 billion people. So we're not going to do it. I mean, it's a proof that we're not going to do it. So we are going to do it differently, and it's the greatest opportunity in human history. It's the greatest business opportunity that has ever happened. And you can see that the people who are capable of designing that change are creating the wealth of the new world. So I fired myself. And I created the Master Change Network to do exactly that with my wife and partner, B.C. Williams. And we basically developed design as a leadership method, taking on some of our thorniest challenges. Now, there's a funny story that actually takes us to these principles. I was made an honorary Royal Designer for Industry in London, in England, as part of the RSA, the Royal Society for the Arts. And it's a program that was actually invented by Ben Franklin, and he wanted to introduce designers, artists, to industry. And so he created this thing called Royal Designers for Industry. And you would get, such a designation for the Queen. I mean, it's a really amazing thing. It's only 200 people, it's very special. And so they asked me to be one of these folks. I was very honored. And they sent a group of young leaders as part of their program to come to Chicago to talk to us where we work. And I showed them, some of this work. And they were very perplexed. They said, "What kind of designer are you? We've never seen something like this, that you design carpets and cities and institutions and social movements and governments, and I mean, it's weird. What do you call yourself?" And I said, "I'm a designer." That's what I do. And they said, "Well, how do you do it?" And I was kind of irritated with them, and I said, "You should have been paying attention because I just showed you." Didn't you see it? They said, "No, you showed us the results, but not the method. How do you do it?" I mean, we think of design as really defined by the product. So, A product designer does products, an architect does buildings, communication designer does graphics. So what kind of designer are you, and how are you able to work that way? And I realized, while I was at the podium, I actually didn't know. I didn't have an answer. And I thought, wow, this is not a good thing. This is not a good day. I need an answer to that question. And so I went home, talked to my wife and said, look, we need an answer. There must be an answer, because we're able to do it. So somehow in our practice, there are a set of principles that inform everything that we do. If we could get those principles, we could help everyone be able to work this way, and allow for anyone even people who aren't designers, to have access to this way of thinking. So we started to work on it. It took about 2 years. We ended up with 24 of them. It starts with first inspire. That is, we put inspiration as our responsibility, not a side effect. We say, your job is to inspire. So you better learn how to do that. Your job is not to do things in hopes that it will inspire. No, your job is to inspire, because you cannot make people go to the future. You cannot, there's no stick that you can apply that will force them to do it. The only way you can do it is by inspiration. You have to show them a future in a way that is so exciting and compelling that they say, oh gosh, I got to write a check for that, because that's where we got to go. And that's really your principal job. So that concept that inspiration is at the core changes fundamentally how we think about the tools that you need to become a designer. And it ends with those who do teach, get out there and do. That in fact, the way that we're going to change the world is to actually do things in a new way, and that we all are teachers. We are all producers and designers, but also teachers. But it's important to know that it's not a linear method. It's not like you start at 1 and go to 24. It's like a toolbox at home. You have a toolbox, you don't always use a hammer first. Right? You know what's in the toolbox, and then you reach for the tool that is most appropriate at that moment. And that's really the method that we've developed. So I want to go through a few of those principles and how they kind of play out in projects. And you can kind of see the relationship. We good? Okay. Any questions right now?
What does design for the impact double mean?
We are escalating in quantity and in capacity. And we mostly think about those things separately. So we think, oh, there's going to be a lot more people, so we can do other things. But in fact, every one of those people is doubling their capacity. So we're doubling the population, we're doubling the double, and we're doubling the capacity. And when you multiply those two doubles, you get an exponential acceleration that is really extraordinary. So you have this whole new possibility for impact. Think about it. We only educate 1% of the world. So far, we have educated with higher education 1%. Think about what happens when it's 2%, 4%, 8%. Right? Like, the doubling of that double is going to radically change our possibility and our capacity and the impact that we can have, both negative and positive. So we can suddenly radically change the landscape by the way that we think. And it's a real new set of challenges. Anything else? I'll move on.
What is the Madonna curve?
The Madonna curve is a way of thinking about how images live in society. When you launch a new thing, when you create a new building, when you create a new image, a brand, a logo, a record, a persona, that thing has the life of a musical note. It goes up, it has a sustain, and then it falls away, no matter how brilliant it is. So no matter how genius that person is, they fade away in the public imagination. And most careers look like that. That's how they work, because they don't understand what Madonna understood. She could feel herself on that curve. She could tell when she was accelerating into the public imagination, and she could feel it falling away. And she knew that it was fading, and when she felt that, she would disappear, and 8 weeks later she would reemerge with a totally new and amazing image. And it would be, when you saw her, it would be like, wow, have you seen it? Have you seen the new? That is the Madonna curve. And so what she realized she could do is she could jump off the top of the curve. So instead of waiting all the way down, going all the way to the bottom, and starting over, she jumped off the top. And when you jump off the top, you capture the equity that you've already created. So that first launch creates a kind of equity in the public imagination. If you launch off the top of that, you get more. And you don't go down. And so she was one of the first people to really understand in a very profound way how that works. And we've taken that into a methodology that anyone can apply to any business or any brand. I'll move on. Okay, so the first one is first inspire. Design is leadership, lead by design. It's really taking that responsibility in to say, you know what? As designers, we have the ability to envision the future. So that's really our responsibility. And for me, Massive Change is the best example of that. And the back cover says it best. It's not about the world of design. It's about the design of the world. It's about our capacity to really shape our world. To do it, we created a new school called the Institute Without Boundaries. And it was a purpose-driven, entrepreneurial, experience-based design education. In other words, you had a really tough challenge in a very public context. That was your assignment. And you had to learn, you had to figure out, how am I going to do this? What do I need to know? How can I get there? What's involved? What do I need to learn in order to accomplish it? What we discovered is that we were producing entrepreneurial design thinkers. And half of our students started new businesses. And if you compare that to the business school performance, business schools, their startup rate is about 5%. So we had a tenfold increase in new business creation. And it's a totally different creation of wealth, creation of value methodology. Massive Change really looked at our capacity to change the world, our capacity to redesign things. And this is the urban economy. We'll create urban shelter for the entire world population. That's what we're committed to. So around the world, we're going to do it. We're building shelter for everyone. And if you imagine what that means over the next, over the first 50 years of this century, imagine taking the world, draw a line around it that bisects the world so that you have half of the world population on either side of that line. We're going to build everything on one side of that line. Again, in the first 50 years. So we're going to build half of the world before mid-century. That's the project that we're committed to. No one is in charge. We are just collectively committed to doing that because humans need it. That we need that shelter, and we are intending to do it. They're like all over the world. That's exactly what's happening. We are looking at design economies of all sorts in this project. So this is the market economy. The market is not a natural space, it's a design space. And how we design it determines what has value, what gets exchanged. And when we fail to design it, we design for failure. So when we turn off market regulation, the regulators, and we turn on the market innovators, and they race ahead, you have the financial crisis. It's really a design crisis, that we were not designing to keep pace with innovation. We look at the image economy. This is like standing inside of a diagram of the electromagnetic spectrum, where the color images are what you see with your naked eye. Everything else is other wavelengths. So we've taken the spectrum, where we only see with our natural vision a tiny, tiny fraction, and we've created technology that we can use wavelengths across the entire spectrum and turn it into an eyeball. So we now have a kind of human eyeball that sees with the entire electromagnetic spectrum. and it profoundly changes what we can see in the universe. Living economies, we will design evolution. We are underway to change the design of life. And we've been doing it for thousands of years. If you have a dog and the dog is not a wolf, then you're on my side. Because if you think a Labradoodle is a natural thing, we should talk later. And in the end, what you see is that we're actually designing wealth. We're redesigning, reimagining wealth. So wealth is capital, of course, but we also have new forms of wealth, new currencies, wealth of information, wealth of access, wealth of mobility. We are living in the wealthiest time in human history, where more people than ever are collaborating and participating in that wealth. So that's the first principle. The second I want to talk about is think forever, design for perpetuity. So most of what we do, we borrow from our kids, we take their stuff, we have a party, and then we leave them a check. And we say, sorry kids, you're going to have to pay for this. And meanwhile, we're having a great time. That's not a plausible future. So we were approached by CocaCola to reimagine the biggest brand in the world in a way that we can do it forever. So they wanted to build a sustainability platform that would change the way that we do the company all over the world so that we can do it in perpetuity. Because they realized being bad for the environment is not true to their brand. That is not a brand value that would sit comfortably with what their vision of the future is. They want to make a happy world, a refreshed world. Well, a refreshed world doesn't involve destroying the environment. So we built the platform for them to really reconceive how we think about the whole enterprise and how we change everything that we do so that in the future we can do Coca-Cola in perpetuity. And when we presented this work at a brand conference in New York City, a big conference, a young guy came up to the microphone and said, look, if you want to be sustainable, why don't you just stop doing Coca-Cola? That's the most sustainable thing you can do. And my partner, the head of global brand, said some kind of mumbo jumbo. I didn't understand what he was talking about. And I said, my answer is actually very simple. That's not a world that I want. I don't want a world where I can't have a Coke. I shouldn't have too many, but I'd love to have a Coke in the future. And I'd love my kids to have a Coke. But I want to do it in a way that I'm not passing a toxic check to them. I'm not giving them the bill for my enjoyment. And that means we're going to change everything. And that's exactly what they're doing. It's decades of work, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to really transform everything that we do. We started work with Neville Isdell, who's the CEO, and they changed CEOs in the process. And Muhtar Kent became the CEO. And when we presented the final work to the executive committee, the 7 people who run Coca-Cola, one of the people said, this should be our new approach to CSR, corporate social responsibility. And I'm personally on a mandate to eliminate CSR. You should not have a CSR department. Because if you have a department of good, what is everybody else doing? You should not have a department of good, unless it's the CEO's office. That's the department of good. The whole enterprise has to be good. And so when this person suggested that, Muhtar immediately said, absolutely not. This is going to change the way we do business for decades to come. And that's really a kind of new way of thinking. It's a new way of understanding, our place of enterprise in our ecology and in our economy. It led to this collaboration with a company called Emeco. So Emeco has been doing the metal chair, the aluminum chair, for 50 years. And they did a collaboration with Coca-Cola to make a version of it made out of PET bottles. So they created a new material that could be used for furniture. And we introduced this concept. First, let's make things that last. So instead of making them to be recycled, of course they need to be recycled. But let's first of all make things that we really love, that you want to keep forever. And we launched this chair, and you can see even by the launch, we had already taken 3.5 million PET bottles out of the landscape, and it's now in many, many, many millions. And it continues to to do that. And most importantly, it doubled their business. So with a single product, they doubled their enterprise and therefore their positive impact in the world. Design the new normal is the next concept. And designing the new normal, again, it changes our mandate. So many designers really want to create an extraordinary, radical new thing. And we need those extraordinary, radical new things. It's part of life. But what we want, ultimately, is a new way of living. And that means a new normal conduct. And that's a totally different project than the kind of classical design challenge. In fact, when you think about our work, like when we're excited, right, when I get a problem and it's really tough, and I can do something extraordinary, I get super excited about that. But the more excited I am, because it's so hard, the more scary it is for most people. So when I hear the words massive change, I'm like, cool, let's go. When most people hear it, they hold their wallet and back out of the room. Like, they don't want massive change. They want massive stay the same. And how can we just tweak it a little bit and not have to do anything? And in fact, we need to understand that. We need to say, we're going to change things, but we're going to do it in a way that makes your life better, not worse. Right? So when you hear the word sustainability, you don't think sacrifice. You think opportunity and better, beautiful, all those other things. So we did a project called Edit, Prosperity for All. It was an exhibition that was really designed in 3 parts: context, design, and impact. It was really trying to understand what's the context we're working in right now, what's the design approach that we need, and what's the impact that we're creating. How can we quantify that? So we start with the work of Paolo Pellegrin. When you entered into the exhibition, you only see the worst human behavior on the planet. So you see the reality of how bad the world can be, how bad we can be. Paolo is one of the best war photographers working today, and he documents human crisis. So he's one of the most beautiful people I've ever met. I mean, just an absolutely wonderful human being. And he has gone to the worst places on the planet over the last half century to go and document the human impact of the things that we're capable of, and find beauty even in those areas of crisis. And so we designed it so that when you walk into the gallery, you only see these images. You're confronted with this extraordinary series of images of how horrible our human behavior can be, how much conflict there is, how much we have to still accomplish, just the kind of worst behavior around the world. When you go beyond those images, when you move behind them, you encounter a kind of colorful world of accomplishment and people designing solutions to all of the 17 Human Development Goals that the UN has established for this century. And so what we did is organize a series of exhibits behind each one of the images that really takes you to another place and gives you hope for what's actually going on. Because mostly we see the black and white images, and the solutions, developments, progress are invisible because they're not conflict and violence. And so we did an installation where we showed a whole series of these people who are really dedicated to that. This is a project by a woman named Zita Cobb. She's a person who made a lot of money in technology. She went back to a little island off the coast of Newfoundland where she grew up. She is the best designers in the world to redesign the ecology and the economy of this place. It's called Fogo Island, and you have to check it out. It's really quite extraordinary. She created an inn, the Fogo Island Inn, and she said, lots of inns have foundations. We're a foundation with an inn. She's really driving a purpose-driven reimagining of this place. She started a fish company, so fishermen who fish sustainably can sell their fish for 3 or 4 times what the normal price is. And she's introduced this extraordinary idea of economic nutrition. that products would have a label on them, like your food does, that tells you the economic nutrition. So it tells you what the profit is, what the investment is, what the ecological impact is, where the income, where the economic activity is located. It would give you an understanding of how your product fits into an economy and an ecology in a new way. We feature this extraordinary project by Bjarke Ingels, which is a new incinerator. But the incinerator has a ski hill on the top of it, so that it's not only an infrastructure, it's also an amenity. So all of a sudden, everyone in Copenhagen, everyone in Denmark wants an incinerator in their neighborhood. It's quite something. And what was really beautiful is that the incinerator has a device in it, and every time it takes a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere, it puffs out a smoke ring, a steam ring, actually. So it puffs a signal to the community that we've succeeded once again in taking a ton of material out of the environment. And then finally, this is a project by a man named Günter Pauli to reconceive how we understand business. That this is the classic model where we take all these inputs, we have one output that we monetize, which is beer, and all the other stuff we either just throw it into the environment or we pay to get rid of it. And the cost of getting rid of it was killing this brewery. Because they're an urban brewery, getting rid of stuff was really expensive. So they realized they had to reconceive it. And this is what they did. They created an ecosystem around beer. So they still do beer, but now they also use the spent grain for worms and for baked goods and for a lot of other businesses. They grow mushrooms, right? So they use the waste products as free inputs for other business activity and completely redesign how the enterprise works. And this is the economic impact. So now the brewery is making about 2/3 of the money, but 1/3 of the money is coming from other businesses. So all of a sudden the business is wildly profitable. And that's the new way of thinking. And almost nothing goes to waste. So in this business, almost nothing is actually exited. And then the third concept was impact. And what I was really surprised by, what we did was we said, look, all over the world, people are visualizing the impact of change. There are incredible artists who are really figuring out, how can I tell the story of these complex systems and impact so that people can actually understand what's going on and take action and change the way that they live. And so we featured about 25 of these people who are really amazing designers. And I want to show you one of them, because this for me is really profound. Almost no one is aware of what this diagram shows. So this shows the world as 100 people over the last 2 centuries. All right, so take 2 centuries ago, 1818. What happened between 1818 and 2018? Well, this is what happened. In 1820, this starts in 1820, 6 people were not living in extreme poverty. 6 out of 100, 6% were not living in extreme poverty. Right? The number inverts, so that by 2015, only 10 are living in extreme poverty. So we went from 94 to 10. Right? And you can see how consistent that is. There's a few bumps along the way, but basically that's a clear and direct transformation. The same is true as in basic education. In 200 years ago, 17 have basic education. Only 17 out of 100 have education at all. Right? By 2015, only 14 have not attained education. Now, we still have a long way to go to get to, really fully educated, advanced education, but you can see the invert, right? How the inversion happened. The same is true of literacy, of democracy. And again, we can see some real serious setbacks. It's not a kind of smooth curve, but it's definitely going in one direction. Of vaccination, which obviously happened quite recently. And again, if we fail to understand these, we open ourselves up to not caring and therefore to losing the progress that we've attained. And so really understanding what's going on is so profoundly important. Stuart Brand told us if people believe that things are getting worse, they do what is natural. They hunker down, they close the borders, they shut the doors, they lock it out, they try to protect what they can get while they can still get it. It's a natural thing to do if you think the world is going to hell in a handcart. And when they see, on the other hand, that we're investing in the future, they want to be part of it. They open up, it's all about collaboration, and that's really what's going on. The reality of our world is collaboration, education, people working together across boundaries, borders, across nations, religions, all the kinds of things that kept us separate in the past. We're designing solutions to that and collaborating in ways that have never happened before. And this is the impact that it's creating. And so for me, that's really what we're committed to. Is that enough? Any questions? How about we take a few questions? I got a couple other things to show you, but let's take a few questions. Because I've taken up quite a lot of time. Yes?
So a lot of the times we have like really sustainable products, which is like awesome and I'm all for it, they become really expensive. And like everybody can't always have access to it. So it kind of becomes only accessible to like rich people. So how do you like in your design like combat that and try to make it accessible for everyone? Because if you can take like a
Yeah.
business model where you're
Yep.
in the US, it becomes more expensive.
Great. So let me repeat the question. For many sustainable products, they become very expensive and therefore not accessible to people beyond the wealthy. And how do we solve that? There isn't a singular solution to that problem, but there is a solution to that problem in every case. In other words, you have to reconceive the problem and therefore reconceive the solution. And we are developing the methodologies and the practices that allow us to get to sustainable and low price and beauty. All right, so in the past, sustainable was, I have to give up, I have to sacrifice. It's going to cost more and be less. That's not a plausible future. People won't sign up for it. We have the data that shows that we've peaked in our ability, our willingness to pay more for sustainability. In other words, in the future, people won't pay more for sustainability. It has to be lower priced. So we have to figure out, how do we make it lower priced? How do we reconceive the economy of it? It has to do with scale, with getting to scale. I mean, if you think about modular housing, there has not been a singular modular housing project that has gotten to scale and therefore to the advantage of modular housing. So modular housing really is a kind of cool way of doing expensive housing. It's not a real solution to get to sustainable housing. But people are working on it all over the world to figure out new ways of doing it. That using printers, using all kinds of new technologies to think about how do we get to scale so that we actually get the advantages of scale. Because if you think about, if your car was made the way your house is, it would cost $200,000 too. Right? So we can't do it in the old way. We have to think about new ways of doing it and really prioritize scale and say that's how we're going to do it ultimately. Other questions? Yes?
The previous slide we showed had a couple of graphs, and it doesn't really talk very much about mental health or cultural diversity. This is actually a decline. It was cultural diversity in particular. And so when you talk about higher education, I think a sinister byproduct of that is forced assimilation. And so I'm just wondering where your take is on that. You keep talking about the world in a kind of homogenous way, the way I'm interpreting your comments.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm just wondering, the rest of the world that's not living at a standard of living that we do in this country.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we approach that world, their knowledge systems, their different ways of thinking, that you're not conforming to these ways that you're representing?
Well, in fact, we're working all over the world on those kinds of problems. And our solution is certainly not conformity, and homogeneity. On the contrary, we're working to help, we did a big project in Guatemala to really help support, a diversity of culture in Guatemala, and a movement of peace in Guatemala. So I'm not in any way suggesting that that's true, and I'm not suggesting that there aren't all kinds of negative impacts. There are horrific, the first chart that I put up, the second chart I put up showed all the environmental impacts that are caused by the sheer quantity of people. However, even in that crisis, there is an extraordinary possibility for development, growth, diversity, all the things that come with what you're describing. And in fact, billions of people have been pulled out of extreme poverty, as you can see. And that makes possible all the other things that we need to do to solve those other problems. So I don't think of it as a monoculture of development. On the contrary, I think diverse ecology is actually our methodology. So for instance, in education, I think we are really kind of dying to get to a new monoculture. Right? So we have one monoculture that doesn't work, and so many people wish there was a better monoculture. And our approach is actually, let's not have a monoculture. Let's have a diverse ecology of learning. And that means that you can support all kinds of things, all kinds of experiments, all kinds of developments. It's not about getting to a new monoculture. It's getting to a diversity of ecological ways of thinking. Does that make sense? Yes?
To go back to one of the other design principles we talked about, that we are not separate from or above nature.
Uh-huh.
It's an interesting concept. How have you seen people address, or how have you addressed, communicating to people that we are part of this overall system? We don't view or manage nature, or that's how the traditional way that we do it,
Uh-huh.
is that we manage nature as something we control or own. How do we insert ourselves, or get people to start to insert themselves into the system?
We work, almost always, our work includes sustainability. So almost always, we're working on a sustainability dimension of what we're doing. And in that process, we help our clients and the people, organizations we work with, to understand that ecology, to understand, what we're doing and the implications that it has. And we have a method called running the numbers, where we just take the organization as it stands and say, let's just run this business for 50 years and look at what happens, right? So one of the biggest challenges that we have is that we don't see the long-term implications because we're so focused on short-term. So we're looking at quarterly results, but the accumulation of impact is happening over decades. So we run the business for 50 years and say, don't improve it or make it worse, just run it as it is. So in the case of CocaCola, they would have produced 2.7 trillion PET bottles and left 2.2 trillion of them in the environment. So if you think that that's not a problem for your business, forget about caring for the environment. If you don't think that 2.2 trillion pieces of garbage with your brand on it is not a brand disaster that will destroy the equity in your business, you're not doing your fiduciary duty. You're not actually being responsible for your business. And so just take it from a purely self-interest standpoint, you can see that, in fact, we're going to have to fix this. And that means we're going to need to invest in all the things that we're going to have to do to change that system. And that's, in fact, what they're doing. So that kind of method is really it's one of the things that we do. Yes?
So you work on this large quantity of projects also.
We start with the problem. We start with the challenge. So often a client will come to me and ask me to do a specific thing. They will say, we need this. We need this. You got to do this. And what we do is say, let's take a step back and we'll walk through the problem and try to understand what are we actually trying to do. So what do we have to solve for? And often in that process, we get to a completely different understanding of what the real goal is. Because almost no one is able to articulate their problem. They articulate the solution. So they say, I need a logo. Actually, you don't need a logo. You have a problem in the way you behave. Let's fix how you behave. The logo will take care of itself. Now, you might need a new logo when you behave properly. That may happen. But actually understanding why you want to, why do you want a new logo? Let's figure out why you're trying to do things. And that why question is really central to design. That's what makes you a designer. And not a technician, you're not in production. Once you ask the question why, you're a designer. And you're trying to figure out, okay, why is this happening? Why don't we change it? Why do we keep doing this? And sometimes there's really not good answers. A lot of things are done simply because we did them before. And we find the same as last year button, and people keep pressing it, and they just keep doing it same as last year, instead of thinking, okay, if we were to do it differently, what would we do? And that's really what we're doing with, I'm the Chief Design Officer for Freeman, and we are completely reinventing the product we create. We create live experience. We're reinventing how we create it, the product that you experience, and the impact that it has, and how people interact with one another. All of that is open for reinvention. But you're not going to do that if you just say, I did the show last year, I'm going to do the show again this year. I'm just going to press that same as last year button, and away we go. You have to stop a moment and say, okay, if we don't do it the same as last year, what could we do? And that opens up a whole new set of possibilities. Yes?
So you said we keep growing, our success is what causes our future problems.
Uh-huh.
Do you see any way that as we move on, we learn how to outpace our own success failures?
Yes.
Is there a way we get ahead?
It's the impact double-double. Like, if we educated 10% of the world, it's already happening. But if we keep going, and we keep accelerating the percentage of people we educate, and we keep giving them tools with greater and greater capacity, what we can do is accelerating. So, for instance, last century we took one disease off the face of the earth. We stopped smallpox. Now, you have to remember, smallpox was a disease that killed hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century. Right? Hundreds of millions. If you've ever seen what it looks like, it is grotesque. And hundreds of millions of people died from that disease. And a group of people decided, we are going to stop smallpox, led by this man named Larry Brilliant, who really lives up to his name. They eradicated smallpox. They basically isolated it. They vaccinated. That chart right there, the middle chart on the left, on the right rather. They did a heroic global effort to eliminate smallpox, and they succeeded. So no one else in the future of millennia will suffer and die from smallpox. And now when you do that, millions, hundreds of millions more people all of a sudden on the graph going up. Right? So when you're doing that, that's how we got the number so high. But Gates Foundation has recently predicted that we will eradicate 4 more diseases in the next decade. So we eradicated 1 in the last century, 4 more in the next decade. And the beat goes on, right? Like there's more and more people working on more and more of those things. We're eradicating hunger. We're educating people. We're liberating women. We're like all of these things advance society, advance freedom, advance possibility, and advance the capacity to solve problems. Because when we liberate them, women invest in their community. They help their children. They educate their children. So all the things that we, as we're solving these problems, it has roll-on positive effects. And we're beginning to develop the tools to address the real global challenges of the environment. So we're starting to get, think about, it's only been in the last few decades that we could actually see the global environment. That we could see an image of what's happening in the world. Right? So that's really new to be able to start to think like that. Now we're starting to build the organizations, tools, there is some backsliding. The fact that America pulled out of Paris is like crazy. There's no other way to put it. We need to be part of this way of thinking, that we can actually think and work globally if we're going to solve the really huge challenges that we're facing. And we're going to need to develop new technologies, new collaborative, but think what happens with translation. We can now sit on a conference call with people from all over the world, speaking different languages, and translating simultaneously. Right? So a group of people who, not too long ago, if you showed up in their country, they would kill you, are now sitting on a conference call. We expect to fly to another country, get off the plane, and use our phone. And if it doesn't work, it's like, So our expectations just keep going higher for what is possible collectively. And I think that revolution of possibility is the greatest, it's like the greatest thing that's happened in human history. And most people are completely unaware that it's happening. And so discovering that revolution and working against the revolution of negation, which is determined to pull us backwards into a past that didn't exist, is, I think, the responsibility of designers and the responsibility of our leaders. On that note, thank you. Thank you.